And you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers.
Neil was the greatest platform orator of his generation.
I'm telling you, you can't play politics with people's jobs and with people's services.
What you had was enormous passion.
They can't respect the gesture generals or the tendency tacticians.
The room kind of erupted.
I'll tell you, and you listen.
Between those furiously supporting him and those furiously denouncing him. It's 1985. Neil Kinnock is about to embark on the mission that consumed him for the next 10 years of trying to make the Labour Party electable again, with one of those magnificent and yet nuanced speeches that he became famous for. Neil Kinnock became leader in 1983 in the wake of a really dreadful election defeat under Michael Foot. He immediately saw his task as turning Labour into a party that could get re-elected again. And the 1985 speech really was the beginning of that process.
We want to honour our undertakings in full, in every sphere, every area of policy. We want to say what we mean and mean what we say. We want to keep our promises. And because we want to do that, it is essential that we don't make false promises.
For context, you have to understand that Neil was the greatest platform orator of his generation. That's a phrase that Roy Hattersley used to me, Roy Hattersley, Neil's deputy, used to me, but it is true. He was a platform speaker like no other. He could move audiences. I remember him before he was leader. I was in Darlington at the Darlington by-election in 1983. I was the Labour Party press officer. And Neil, who was then the education spokesman, turned up and we took him to a hall overflowing. And for an hour, he had a vast audience weeping and laughing with him. And I remember one of his phrases from that. He said, now the cabinet, you remember that there were the cabinet wets, that is, the people who Margaret Thatcher thought weren't proper Tories. He said, now the cabinet wets, by the way, do you know why they call them that? It's because that's what they do when she shouts at them. And everybody, the whole room, it was, in the context, it was wonderful. He was a great phrase maker, and that's one of his great forgotten phrases. Nobody remembers that one anymore.
We must not casually make promises that are so fanciful, so self-indulgent, so exaggerated, that they can be completely falsified by the realities in which we live and the realities that we know we shall encounter. That precondition is unavoidable, total, insurmountable, and it's a precondition, and in this movement we don't want to surmount. It is the precondition that we win a general election. That is the precondition.
All party leaders, when they address their party conference, have two audiences to talk to. They've got to talk to the party faithful who are in the room, and they've got to talk to the general public. They've got to talk to the electors. And they've got to somehow find a way of talking to both those audiences. Nobody ever found that way as successfully as Neil Kinnock did in 1985. He produced a speech and a set of phrases that the party faithful were going to understand and appreciate and say, yes, Neil is one of us. And the world outside was also going to understand and say, yes, this man understands our concerns.
Implausible promises don't win victories. I'll tell you what happens with impossible promises. You start with far-fetched resolutions. They are then pickled into a rigid dogma, a code. And you go through the years sticking to that, outdated, misplaced, irrelevant to the real needs, and you end in the grotesque chaos of a Labour council hiring taxis to scuttle around the city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers.
The Militant tendency was a Trotskyist group whose view was that they had to bring that instead of working outside the established political parties, they had to take over a major political party. And they started to try to take over the Labour Party. And their big success was to lead the Labour Council in Liverpool. And the militant Labour leader in Liverpool was called Derek Hatton. And a little while before the great 1985 speech, he had got the council to the state where it was having to fire some of its own employees because it couldn't make the books balance. What Neil Kinnock really knew was that as long as people thought, wrongly, but thought, that the Labour Party and he were controlled by Militant and were unable to put Militant in its place, Labour would continue to be unelectable. He therefore had to change that, and he had to use this speech to change that. He pounced upon Militant with this sudden, unexpected roaring into Militant. And one of the tricks of oratory is to spring something on people so that they're not so that the opposition isn't quite expecting it. The grotesque sight of a Labour council
hiring taxis to scuttle around a city, handing out redundancy notices to its own workers.
The room kind of erupted, as he must have known it would, between those furiously supporting him and those furiously denouncing him.
The voice of the people, not the people here, the voice of the real people with real needs is louder than all the boos that can be assembled. Understand that, please, comrades, in your socialism, in your commitment to those people. Understand it. The people will not, cannot abide posturing. They can't respect the gestured generals or the tendency tacticians. Comrades, it seems to me lately that some of our number become like sort of latter-day public school boys. It seems it matters not whether you won or lost, but how you played the game. We can't take that inspiration from Rudyard Kipling.
Eric Caffer, who was a left-wing Labour MP, was pictured by all the television cameras walking out in protest. Derek Hatton was pictured at the back of the hall shouting at Neil. But what I found more interesting than either of those is that if you look at those pictures, you see behind him two stony faces, and they remained stony all the way through. And they belonged to two left-wing Labour MPs, Joan Maynard and Dennis Skinner. Joan Maynard, I have to say, I knew well, and I always rather liked her. She acquired the name of Stalin's granny. Everybody referred to her as Stalin's granny, which I always thought was a little bit unfair. But on the other hand, if you look at her stony face behind Neil when he is doing the rest of his speech, it does seem to fit just a little tiny bit. Of course, what all political leaders learned from that moment is never again to have the national executive lined up around you, but instead to bring a microphone out into the audience, to be able to choose the backdrop to your speech.
If those game players get isolated, hammered, blocked off, they might try to blame others, workers, trade unions, some other leadership, the people of the city for not showing sufficient revolutionary consciousness, always somebody else, and then they claim a rampant victory. Whose victory?
Neil Kinnock was the greatest political orator of his generation, the greatest political orator of many years, probably the greatest political orator since his fellow Welshman Nye Bevan in the 1940s, 1950s. His socialism was infectious. What you had was enormous passion, so that he was able, at one and the same time, to trample upon those whom he believed, rightly I think, were going to ensure that Labour could not form another government, and yet at the same time to transmit a vision of how a Labour government would differ from a Conservative government.
Because I owe this party everything I've got, not the job, not being leader of the Labour Party. I owe this party every life chance I've had from the time I was a child. The life chance of a comfortable home, with working parents, people who had jobs, a life chance of moving out of a pest and damp infested set of rooms into a decent home built by a Labour council under a Labour government. The life chance of an education that went on for as long as I wanted to take it. Me and millions of others of my generation got all their chances from this movement.
My favourite line from that speech is that long passage about how everything in life I owe to the Labour Party. And of course he didn't mean just the Labour Party. He meant what was called in those days the Labour movement, which meant the Labour Party and the trade unions. That everything in his life he owed to the Labour Party, and he was, and what you understood from that was that he was determined to go on and transmit that to the next generation as the leader of a Labour government.
We've got to win, not for our sakes, but really, truly, to deliver the British people from evil. Let's do it.
He lost the 1987 election, but had clearly made progress, and there were great hopes that he would win the following general election. He went on to lose very narrowly the 1992 election and resigned as Labour leader, and the work he had done, all the heavy lifting of making Labour electable again, the beneficiary of all that in the end was Tony Blair. It is probably the case that even so long afterwards, if Neil had not been there and determined to make sure that the Labour Party could be elected again, the 1997 Blair government might never have happened.
I didn't begin New Labour. Neil did.
The lesson that Tony Blair drew from it was that what we used to call the Labour movement was out of date and had nothing to do with, and was not of interest to voters any longer. That, I think, was not Neil's view and was not Neil's intention. But the concept of the Labour movement that he had been talking about, the Labour movement that had given him and working class children of his generation all the life chances they ever had, that concept no longer existed.